today. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time today talking about maybe not the most exciting part of everybody's project, but is how to deal with some of the risk and compliance pieces, particularly around KYC. So, you know, a little bit of just who we are as a company. You know, my co-founder and myself both have over 20 years of startup experience in the internet space and now in the blockchain space. And we're the only identity company that I'm aware of that's been operating primarily in the blockchain space for the last 4 years, and has been focused around creating standards and building other specific solutions for the blockchain industry. And we've been working with exchanges, token sales, banks, enterprises, and in some cases, governments. So in this talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about KYC for blockchain, a little bit of history, some of the enforcement actions that have occurred along the way. What are the best practices and standards today so that you can implement them in your own project? And sort of what do the processes look like today? And what should you expect so that you're not surprised as you get into working on your project itself? So, you know, the early years of blockchain, there was actually very little regulatory oversight. You know, Bitcoin was thought to be anonymous. You know, it was thought to be kind of outside of regulatory control. And for the most part, actually, regulators left the space alone, other than when there were kind of big blow-ups in the space, things like Silk Road or Mt. Gox. Unfortunately, that anonymity that people thought was there was actually foiled by the practices that they kept in place, where people doing things like reusing addresses and other things actually made it fairly easy to track back who was the owner of different transactions. You know, and there was some enforcement even in those early days, right? Ripple was probably one of the first enforcement actions we saw, and that was FinCEN out of the Treasury Department did an enforcement there. They actually had a consent decree with Ripple. And at the time, this was seen to be actually a relatively small fine. If you look at fines that the Treasury Department metes out, that usually has like 6 more zeros at the end of it, or 4 or 5 more zeros anyway, when they're handing out fines. And you know, this was specifically related, among other things, to identity-related KYC, something called travel rule and AML around it. And you know, this was actually like the first time that Treasury Department actually reached out and said, hey, we have jurisdiction over these blockchain applications. So sort of the middle years from my perspective were about the middle of 2014 through about the middle of last year. And from a regulatory enforcement perspective, the place where regulators were primarily looking at things and law enforcement was primarily looking at things was around that fiat to crypto border. So it was the exchanges that were connected to the traditional fiat system. And those types of places were the places where Treasury and other enforcement groups were starting to exert some level of oversight, because it was most clearly inside of their boundaries of things that they had responsibility around. At the same time, as people were ramping up and onboarding their customers, that KYC process and that onboarding process has been, and in many cases continues to be, very manual. And this has led to customer service issues for the exchanges, where customers are unhappy because they're trying to either up their trading limits or deposit more money or withdraw their money, and they're running into challenges because they're not approved to the right level of access. And then, you know, that actually can hit the reputation of the underlying exchange, because the customer is like, well, wait, I can't withdraw my money. Is the exchange I'm working with solvent? When actually the exchange itself is doing fine. It's just having a really hard time keeping up with the new demand that's come in place. And so, you know, this has ended up being a reputational issue in addition to a service issue for some of the companies in the space. And, you know, the enforcement continued in that era. Bitfinex actually had enforcement from the CFTC, which is a different group than the Treasury. It was an even smaller settlement. It was about $75,000. And they agreed to some changes in the way that they would operate their business to meet the regulatory standards there. This was focused more around some trading stuff and futures kinds of things rather than AML and KYC. One of the interesting kind of side effects of that is there's a number of people that question whether the changes that were made as a result of the CFTC consent decree, made it easier for a hacker to end up stealing $70 million worth of Bitcoin from Bitfinex. So, sometimes having to respond to regulatory, I don't know whether that's true or not, but, sometimes having to respond to regulatory things quickly can end up having unintended consequences. And so we'll talk a little bit later about really planning in advance for these kinds of things, rather than having to respond in a rapid nature. So, I would consider the modern era, kind of from a regulatory enforcement, kind of being from the middle of last year through now. And really what sort of accelerated a lot of this was the growth in the price of assets and the number of people coming onto the platforms as a result, as well as token sales and the amount of money that was being raised there. International enforcement started for the first time. And so you started seeing US regulators as well as overseas regulators go after companies and individuals that resided outside of their own jurisdiction. And things went from just being fines to moving to criminal charges and jail time. So the regulators and law enforcement have been escalating the level of pressure they put on place. And the focus expanded to crypto exchanges. So where before the enforcement and the pressure had primarily been on exchanges that have connections to the banking system, now the crypto exchanges are starting to get those same phone calls. And then obviously token sales are something new that's really come up fast and furious during that time. Token sales have their own requirements. And then as many of you in this room know, the backlogs at the exchanges in terms of onboarding and upping the levels of access that you have by going through more KYC, those backlogs have continued and in some cases even increased and gotten much worse because some of the automated tools have not yet been fully implemented. And some selected enforcement from there, probably the most eye-popping one was a company called BTCE. This was eye-popping for a number of reasons. One is just the size of the action. The other is that this was a US law enforcement action. US Treasury Department did it. And neither the company, BTCE, nor the individuals who were arrested were in the United States. There was an individual, one of the founders of the company was actually arrested while he was on vacation in Greece by Interpol. And there was a total of 110 million in fines. There's people in jail. And this was all around anti-money laundering violations. And so this is the first time there's been an action of that scope. And that was in July of last year. And then on the token sale side, there's very recently one called Munchie. There have been a couple enforcements on the SEC side. This was around the selling of unregistered securities. And in this case, the SEC was actually pretty nice. In my opinion, I think a number of people's opinions, Munchie just gave the money back, and they said no harm, no foul. And so that's kind of like an early slap on the wrist, but these things may continue, so pay a lot of attention to what's happening on the security side, because what you saw on the AML side was an escalation over time, where the enforcement actions got stronger and stronger, so pay attention in the early phases. And so where does that leave us today? So just in the United States, there's multiple agencies that are watching, right? There's the CFTC, the SEC, the Treasury Department, as well as a number of state actors now. BitConnect was recently shut down by, I think, Texas and North Carolina ended up shutting down their operations. And then global enforcement is stepping up as well. You're seeing actions in China, South Korea, and other places. And all of us in this room, we need to meet those new requirements. Frankly, it's really hard to innovate from prison. And we need to meet those requirements while we're still trying to grow and scale our businesses, right? And so we need to make sure that we're meeting intense requirements in a way that's automatable, repeatable, and scalable. And so what are some of the requirements that people have today? Because I think that this will be useful for you as you evaluate what you're doing in your own projects. The ID itself has to be real and valid. Just scraping information off something that looks like an ID isn't good enough. You need to know that that ID is real. You need to match the individual to the ID. So, taking a selfie is good. Taking a video is good. Actually pulling the frames out of that video to be able, or pulling the selfie and being able to biometrically match that to the ID is better. That actually follows the government, the NIST standards around digital identity and remote KYC. You need to check sanctions and watch lists, and you need to do negative news searches. So this is all part of the diligence process that you're actually required to do on investors as well as users of your system that are able to transfer funds. And then on the corporate side, you need to get incorporation and tax ID information. You need to take the signatories, the people who are operating on behalf of that account, and put them through the same KYC process that you would put an individual through, so everything on that previous slide. You need to do KYC now of the ultimate beneficial owners, or underlying beneficial owners. It's the people that actually own that company or corporation. So, you know, I think if you own more than 5% or so of the company, you need to be KYC'd as well. And then sanctions, watch lists, negative news, et cetera. And then with the SEC, if you guys are doing a security token or something that looks like a security token, and by the way, with all of this, you should definitely talk to a compliance lawyer. I am not a compliance lawyer. I'm a technology guy that provides tech solutions. If you're taking people's funds, you should have a compliance lawyer that you're talking to about this that really frames this in detail for you. But this is an SEC requirement. The requirement varies by jurisdiction. So an accredited investor in the US is different than an accredited investor overseas. An accredited investor is basically someone who is judged to be able to invest in more risky projects like startups. So they either have a certain amount of wealth or they work in the investing industry or something like that. So the best practices around accredited investor checks is actually not to collect the documents yourself and do that validation, but to use a third-party expert like an accountant or a lawyer or someone like that that signs off that that person is an accredited investor and then sends you that attestation. So that's typically, and in that case, typically your investor will feel better about sending their documents to a lawyer, accountant, or a professional that has a duty not to change, you know, not to report on any of that, than they do sending it to you as a company they're investing in anyway. And then, you know, just kind of how do we do KYC today, right? Is the ID real? Have you checked all the security features, things like that? Has it been tampered with? Have people tried to change the text or the photos? Is it expired? Is it legible? You know, things like that. Photos of photos don't count. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people try and take a photo of an ID that's on their computer screen. You know, that's not good. It has to actually be the ID. So that's one of the things. You know, and then matching the ID to the individual, biometric matches. You can do video. You can use that to actually do sentiment analysis to see if someone's under duress at the time that they're doing things. It's pretty cool. You can obviously tie to people's mobile phones and potentially tie to social, although that's not really recognized as valuable by regulators yet. You know, sanctions and watch lists. So one of the things to warn you about with sanctions, watch lists, negative news, this is where your false positives are going to come up and where you're going to have to do manual work. Because like there's going to be a bunch of people named John Smith, some of them will be bad, and so they'll show up on a watch list if one of your investors has that name, and you're going to have to kind of go through and validate that that's not the same one. And I was going to do a demo now, but we don't have video set up here, so I'll skip that and say, why don't you come by my booth and get a demo, and we can kind of walk you through some of how these best practices work in the real world. Thanks for your time today, everybody.